The sun crept slowly over the horizon, casting golden light across the rolling fields and dense woods of the countryside. A soft mist hung over the land, clinging to the dew-covered grass and wrapping the old wooden fences in a silken haze. The gentle chirping of birds broke the stillness, mingling with the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind danced through the trees. It was the kind of serene morning that made the world feel vast, yet deeply intimate. In the heart of this quiet, rural expanse stood Eli Carter's modest farmhouse, a weathered structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Eli, a man in his early 50s, moved with the deliberate pace of someone unbothered by time but burdened by solitude. A widower for nearly a decade, his days followed a regimented rhythm, feeding his animals, tending to his crops, and retreating into the silence of his empty home. Though the land around him teemed with life, Eli's heart carried an emptiness he couldn't shake. But on this particular morning, as Eli prepared to start another predictable day, something stirred in the woods, a fleeting shadow and the glint of amber eyes. Unbeknownst to him, this encounter would forever alter his quiet, lonely world. The cold bite of a late autumn night settled over Eli Carter's farm. The moon, full and luminous, bathed the countryside in a silver glow, illuminating the fields and casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. The stillness of the night was interrupted only by the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustling of dry leaves swept by the brisk wind. Eli, dressed in a heavy coat and boots, stepped out of his creaking porch to check on a loose barn door rattling in the wind. He approached the barn. A low, guttural growl froze him mid-step. His eyes darted toward the shadowy edge of the barn where a faint movement caught his attention. Stepping cautiously into the moonlight was a wolf, its fur matted and streaked with blood. One of its legs dragged limply, leaving a faint trail in the dirt. Its amber eyes locked with Eli's, glowing with a mix of defiance and desperation. Fear gripped Eli's chest as he stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Wolves were predators, unpredictable and dangerous. Yet, as he observed the animal's labored breathing and trembling frame, something shifted within him. It wasn't just a wolf. It was a creature in pain, fighting for survival. Eli's first instinct was to retreat, to let the animal fend for itself. But as the wolf swayed unsteadily, a faint whimper escaped its throat. The sound stirred something deep within him, a memory of helplessness, of his wife's final days when he too felt powerless. Against his better judgment, Eli slowly approached, his hands raised in a gesture of caution. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice steady despite the rapid beat of his heart. The wolf bared its teeth but didn't move, watching him warily. Eli grabbed an old blanket from the barn and knelt at a safe distance, carefully sliding it toward the wolf. "You'll freeze out here," he muttered. The wolf hesitated but made no move to attack. Slowly, Eli managed to coax it into the barn, shutting the door gently behind him. That night, as the wind howled outside, Eli found himself tending to the wolf's wounds with trembling hands, unsure why he was helping this wild creature, but unable to turn away. The barn smelled of hay and earth, the air thick with the damp chill of the autumn night. Eli Carter stood at a distance, watching the wolf curled on a bed of straw. Its sides rose and fell unevenly, each breath labored but persistent. The dim glow of the lantern on a nearby beam cast flickering shadows emphasizing the wolf's ragged state. Matted fur, a bleeding gash on its flank, and the tremble of its muscles as it fought to stay alert. Eli worked methodically, his hands trembling, slightly as he prepared a warm basin of water and tore an old sheet into strips for bandages. His mind raced with doubt. What was he doing, risking his safety for a wild animal? Yet something about the wolf's piercing amber eyes, filled with pain but not malice, urged him to stay. When Eli approached, the wolf raised its head, teeth bared in a weak snarl. He stopped, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Easy now," he muttered, holding out a chunk of bread soaked in warm milk. The wolf's nostrils flared, and its gaze flicked between Eli and the food. Hunger won over fear. Tentatively, it stretched its neck forward, snatching the offering before retreating a few steps. The next few days were a delicate dance of patience and caution. Eli cleaned the wound, his touch gentle despite the wolf's growls and snapping jaws. The first time he pressed a damp cloth to its injury, the wolf jerked away, limping to the corner of the barn. But Eli persisted, sitting nearby with soft-spoken reassurances until the wolf allowed him closer. Feeding time became a ritual of silent negotiation. Eli left bowls of food and water just out of reach, stepping back to give the wolf space to approach. Each time it ate, its movements were hesitant, as though expecting a trap. But Eli made no sudden gestures, no attempts to assert dominance. Slowly, the wolf began to lower its guard. One evening, while applying fresh bandages, Eli felt the wolf's breath warm against his arm. For the first time, it didn't flinch or growl. Instead, it held his gaze, its amber eyes softening with something that resembled trust. "There you go," Eli murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're figuring this out, aren't we?" The wolf's recovery progressed in fits and starts. Its once matted fur grew smoother, its ribs less pronounced as Eli carefully prepared meals with scraps of meat and broth. The limp persisted, but its movements became steadier. The wolf would venture outside the barn, circling the perimeter before returning to its makeshift den. Yet the tension lingered, a delicate balance between man and beast. Eli often felt the wolf's gaze on him, intense and probing, as though it were deciding whether he was friend or foe. Despite the wolf's gradual acceptance, Eli remained cautious, never forgetting its wild nature. One crisp morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the barn's wooden slats, Eli opened the door to let in the fresh air. The wolf stood at the threshold, its nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents. It turned to Eli, its head cocked slightly, before stepping outside. For a moment, Eli thought it might leave for good. But the wolf stopped a few yards away, its eyes locking onto his. It was a silent acknowledgement, a fragile truce forged in the shared quiet of those days in the barn. Eli felt a small smile tug at his lips. "Go on then," he said, though his chest tightened at the thought of losing the wolf. But instead of vanishing into the woods, the wolf returned to the barn that evening, settling onto the straw as though it had found its place. Man and wolf had begun to understand each other, their mutual wariness replaced by a tentative, unspoken bond. As the weeks passed, Eli and the wolf began to settle into an unspoken rhythm, their lives intertwined in a way Eli hadn't anticipated. The wolf, though still cautious, had started to follow Eli beyond the barn, its limping gait less pronounced with each passing day. It lingered near the edge of the field as Eli worked, its amber eyes scanning the horizon, alert to every sound and movement. At first, Eli found the wolf's presence distracting. He was used to the solitude of farm life, the quiet broken only by the rustling of crops or the clink of tools. But now there was a constant companion, a shadow that moved when he moved, stopping when he stopped. Despite himself, Eli found comfort in the wolf's watchful presence. One chilly morning, as Eli repaired a section of the fence, he noticed the wolf pacing nearby. He wiped sweat from his brow and called out, "You don't have to stay, you know. Go on, find your pack." But the wolf merely tilted its head as though considering his words before settling on its haunches in the frost-dusted grass. The bond between them grew in small, quiet moments. One afternoon, while Eli was planting winter crops, the wolf startled, a flock of sparrows sending them into a flurry of wings and chirps. The wolf froze, its ears perked, before leaping and twirling in a playful attempt to catch them. Eli couldn't help but chuckle, a deep, unfamiliar sound that startled even himself. It had been years since Eli had laughed like that, a sound full of genuine warmth and joy. The farm had long felt like a place of duty rather than delight. But now, with the wolf by his side, the mundane tasks seemed lighter. There were other moments, too. The wolf had a curious streak, often nudging open doors with its nose or pawing at Eli's coat when he returned from errands in town. Once Eli caught it nosing through a pile of dried herbs his wife had hung in the kitchen years ago. "You'd have liked her," Eli said softly, watching the wolf sniff the lavender in time. Mary always said there was beauty in the most unlikely places. Mary had been the heart of the farm, the one who saw magic in every sunrise, every stubborn sprout pushing through the soil. She believed in finding wonder where others saw nothing, a philosophy that had baffled Eli's practical mind. Yet, as he watched the wolf's ears twitch at the sound of the wind, Eli realized Mary might have been onto something. One crisp afternoon, Eli ventured into the woods to gather firewood. The wolf trailed behind, its keen nose scanning the ground. When Eli paused to chop kindling, the wolf wandered off, returning minutes later with a curious object clamped in its jaws, a small, weathered leather pouch. Eli crouched, taking the pouch from the wolf's gentle grip. Inside was a silver locket, its tarnished surface gleaming faintly in the dappled sunlight. Eli opened it to reveal a faded photograph of a young couple, their faces bright with laughter. "Well, would you look at that?" Eli murmured, glancing at the wolf. "You've got an eye for treasure." The moment felt symbolic, a quiet reminder of connections lost and found. Eli slipped the locket into his pocket, a small smile lingering on his lips as he resumed his work, the wolf sitting contentedly nearby. Their bond continued to grow, marked by a mix of routine and surprises. The wolf began accompanying Eli on longer outings, walking beside him with a quiet confidence that softened the wary glances of townsfolk. At first, there were murmurs of concern. Wolves, after all, weren't pets. But as people noticed the wolf's calm demeanor and the newfound lightness in Eli's step, their curiosity turned to acceptance. On evenings by the fire, Eli would sometimes speak to the wolf, his voice low and reflective. He told it about Mary, how she'd loved the land, how she'd taught him to notice the beauty in small things. The wolf would lie at his feet, its ears twitching at the sound of Eli's voice as though understanding the weight of his words. One particularly cold night, as the wind howled outside, the wolf padded over to Eli's chair and rested its head on his knee. Startled, Eli hesitated before placing a hand on its thick fur. "You're a strange one," he said with a soft chuckle. "But maybe that's what I needed." In time, Eli began to notice changes in himself. He no longer awoke with the same heavy ache of loneliness. His days, though still filled with the same chores, felt richer, more purposeful. The wolf had become more than a companion. It was a reminder of resilience, of finding connection in the unlikeliest of places. And in those quiet moments, as man and wolf sat side by side under the wide expanse of the starry sky, Eli couldn't help but feel that Mary's spirit lingered, guiding him toward the light he'd long forgotten how to see. The serenity of Eli's farm was shattered one crisp morning when the sound of raised voices carried across the fields. He stepped outside, his brow furrowed, to see a group of villagers gathered near the edge of his property. Their faces were stern, their postures tense, and their eyes darted toward the barn where the wolf was resting. "There's a wolf on your land, Carter," shouted Tom Harris, a wiry man known for his fiery temper. "It's only a matter of time before it goes after our livestock." Eli's stomach tightened. He had known this moment might come, yet he wasn't prepared for the hostility radiating from the group. Behind them, the villagers' dogs barked, straining against their leashes as they caught the wolf's scent. "It hasn't harmed anyone," Eli said, stepping forward, his voice calm but firm. "It's injured and recovering, that's all." "You can't trust a wolf," another man interjected, shaking his head. "They're predators, plain and simple. If you don't deal with it, we will." The words hung heavy in the air. Eli's eyes flicked to the barn where he could see the wolf watching from the shadows. Its amber gaze was steady, unafraid, yet Eli could sense the tension in its posture. The old Eli might have acquiesced, eager to avoid confrontation. But as he looked at the group before him, their pitchforks and torches metaphorically raised, something inside him stirred. A fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. "This wolf hasn't done anything to you," Eli said, his voice rising. "It's been here for weeks and not a single sheep or chicken has gone missing. You're letting fear cloud your judgment." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Tom stepped closer, his tone sharp. "You're risking the safety of the whole village for a wild animal. What happens when it turns on you?" Eli squared his shoulders, his eyes blazing. What happens when we lose our humanity? This wolf was hurt and alone just like any of us might be. It deserves a chance just like we all do. The crowd hesitated, uncertainty flickering in their expressions. Eli knew he was challenging. More than their fear of the wolf, he was confronting their assumptions about him, the reclusive farmer who had spent years keeping his distance. "You all knew Mary," Eli continued, his voice softer now. "She always said we should look for the good in others even when it's hard to see. This wolf has shown me more loyalty than I've seen in years. I'm not turning my back on it." The villagers exchanged glances, their resolve faltering. Some muttered their discontent, but others looked thoughtful, perhaps even moved. Tom scowled, shaking his head. "Don't say we didn't warn you," he muttered before turning and stalking off, the others following reluctantly. Eli stood his ground until the last of them disappeared over the hill. Only then did he exhale, his chest tight with the weight of the confrontation. He turned back to the barn where the wolf emerged cautiously, its head low but its eyes fixed on him. "It's all right," Eli said, his voice trembling slightly. "They're gone." The wolf approached him slowly, its movements graceful yet deliberate. For a moment it simply stared at Eli, its gaze piercing but warm. Then, in an uncharacteristic gesture, it nuzzled its head against his hand. Eli's throat tightened. The gesture spoke of trust, gratitude, and a bond that had transcended the boundaries of species. "We'll get through this," Eli murmured, stroking the wolf's thick fur. Together, the encounter with the villagers marked a turning point for Eli. Defending the wolf had forced him to confront his own fears, not just of judgment but of vulnerability and connection. The wolf, once a symbol of wild unpredictability, had become a mirror for Eli's own struggles, showing him the strength that lay in loyalty and compassion. Over the following weeks, Eli noticed a subtle shift in the villagers. A few began stopping by the farm, curious about the wolf. Children whispered stories about the farmer and his guardian wolf, their imaginations transforming the animal into a local legend. Eli, too, found himself growing bolder, his once isolated life now woven into the fabric of the community. He spoke of the wolf not as a threat but as a reminder of the power of trust and resilience. In standing against fear and convention, Eli had reclaimed something he'd lost long ago, a sense of purpose and the courage to protect what mattered most. The wolf, once a lonely wanderer, had become both a companion and a catalyst for change, proving that even in adversity, connection could triumph. The wolf's amber eyes reflected the soft glow of the fireplace, their depth hinting at untold stories and an enigmatic past. Eli often found himself studying the creature during quiet evenings, captivated by the contrasts it embodied. Wild, and yet oddly trusting, fierce but undeniably fragile. Despite the bond they had forged, the wolf remained a mystery, and Eli's curiosity grew with each passing day. One afternoon, while brushing the wolf's fur to remove clumps of dirt and debris, Eli's hand froze as his fingers brushed against a raised patch of skin near its shoulder. Parting the fur gently, he revealed a mark, a faint but unmistakable brand, its edges jagged as though hastily applied. The symbol was unfamiliar, but its presence told a story of captivity, a life touched by human interference. "Who did this to you?" Eli muttered, his voice thick with anger and sorrow. The wolf shifted uneasily, its ears flicking back as though sensing Eli's distress. That night, as the wind howled outside, Eli sat by the fire, lost in thought. His mind raced with questions. Had the wolf been part of a traveling show, chained and exploited? Or perhaps it had escaped from a hunting facility, where it had been viewed as nothing more than a trophy. The brand hinted at cruelty, and Eli felt a pang of guilt for the harm inflicted on his companion. The next morning, Eli visited the town library, a place he hadn't stepped foot in for years. Dust motes floated in the air as he scanned the shelves for books about wolves, his fingers brushing over faded spines. He eventually found an old volume of local folklore, its pages yellowed and brittle. Back at the farm, Eli read late into the night, the crackling fire providing the only light. The book was filled with tales of wolves that roamed the region long ago, some said to possess almost mystical qualities. One story spoke of a wolf with eyes like fire, rumored to have led a pack that protected lost travelers. Another described wolves marked with strange symbols, believed to be cursed or blessed by the spirits of the forest. Eli chuckled at the absurdity of the tales, but couldn't shake the feeling that there was a kernel of truth buried in the myths. He thought of the wolf's brand and its wary but loyal nature. Perhaps its past wasn't entirely rooted in folklore, but the stories hinted at a bond between man and wolf that transcended the ordinary. One crisp morning, as frost glistened on the ground, Eli decided to follow the wolf into the woods. It had taken to wandering off for hours at a time, always returning by dusk. Curious, Eli trailed it from a distance, careful not to disturb its natural instincts. The wolf moved with purpose, weaving through dense trees and skirting the edges of a frozen stream. At one point, it paused, sniffing the air before trotting toward a clearing. Eli hesitated, crouching behind a thicket as he watched the wolf approach a cluster of stones arranged in an almost deliberate pattern. The wolf sniffed the stones, circling them before lying down, its head resting on its paws. The scene struck Eli as both tender and somber, as though the wolf were visiting a sacred place. He wondered if this clearing held some significance, a pack it had lost or a place it once called home. When the wolf returned to the farm that evening, Eli felt a newfound respect for the creature's resilience. Whatever pain it carried, it bore it with quiet dignity. Eli decided to embrace the wolf's mysteries rather than attempt to unravel them fully. Still, the brand nagged at him. A week later, while running errands in town, Eli stopped by the veterinary clinic to ask discreetly about animal branding. The veterinarian, an older man with a kind demeanor, explained that brands were often used on livestock or captive animals, but some marks were unique to breeders or wildlife facilities. Eli described the brand, and the vet's expression darkened. Sounds like the kind used by illegal wildlife traders. Wolves like that are often taken from the wild, sold to private owners or hunting reserves. If your wolf has that mark, it's been through hell. The words hit Eli like a punch to the gut. He returned to the farm with a heavy heart, his anger simmering at the cruelty inflicted on his companion. That night, as the wolf lay by the fire, Eli knelt beside it, his hand resting on its fur. "Whatever they did to you, you're safe now," he said softly. The wolf's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was an understanding between them deeper than words. Eli's commitment to the wolf grew even stronger. He couldn't change its past, but he could ensure its future was free from harm. He reinforced the boundaries of his property to protect the wolf from curious villagers and predators alike. He began to notice the wolf's habits, its preference for certain foods, its tendency to watch the sunrise from the porch, and adjusted his life to accommodate its needs. The seasons shifted, bringing with them the promise of renewal. The once barren fields around Eli's farm were now alive with vibrant green shoots, the scent of earth and growth carried on the breeze. Eli and the wolf had settled into a harmonious rhythm, their bond evident in the way they moved through the days together, each drawing strength and solace from the other. One fateful afternoon, dark clouds rolled in unexpectedly, blotting out the sun and casting the farm in a murky gloom. Eli, tending to his crops, glanced up at the sky. A storm was brewing, the kind that brought fierce winds and driving rain. He hurried to secure the barn and house, the wolf trailing behind, its ears pinned back against the rising wind. As Eli struggled with a stubborn latch on the barn door, a crack of thunder echoed across the fields. The wolf let out a sharp bark, its body tense and alert. At first, Eli didn't understand, but the wolf began pacing and barking toward the east field, its movements urgent and insistent. "What is it?" Eli asked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. The wolf darted toward the field, stopping to look back at Eli. Trusting his companion's instincts, Eli followed. In the east field, the storm had dislodged a portion of fencing, leaving the sheep vulnerable. Several had wandered perilously close to a ditch rapidly filling with rainwater. Eli's heart raced as he scrambled to herd them back, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. The wolf sprang into action, darting around the sheep with an agility that belied its injured past. Together they worked to guide the animals to safety, the wolf's sharp barks and Eli's steady commands cutting through the chaos. By the time the last sheep was secured, Eli was soaked to the bone, his muscles aching, but relief flooded him as he patted the wolf's head. "Couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. The wolf's eyes met his, glowing with a quiet satisfaction. The storm passed, leaving the farm battered but intact. Eli and the wolf stood side by side, watching the clouds part to reveal a sky streaked with the warm hues of sunset. The moment felt like a triumph, a testament to their partnership and the trust they had built. As the days turned into weeks, Eli began to notice subtle changes in the wolf. It spent more time lingering near the edge of the woods, its ears twitching at distant sounds. The wolf was healing, its strength returning, and with it the pull of the wild. Eli knew this day would come, but the thought of letting go filled him with a bittersweet ache. One morning, as the first light of dawn painted the sky, Eli opened the barn door to find the wolf waiting outside. It stepped closer, nuzzling its head against his hand, a gesture of affection and farewell. Eli knelt, running his fingers through its fur one last time. "You've got a life out there," he murmured. "It's time for you to live it." The wolf turned, its gait steady and confident as it disappeared into the trees. Eli watched until it was no longer visible, the forest swallowing its familiar shape. The farm felt quieter in the wolf's absence, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of peace, not loneliness. The wolf had left an indelible mark on Eli's life, teaching him the power of trust, resilience, and connection. Months later, Eli stood at the edge of the woods, watching a pair of amber eyes glint in the shadows before vanishing. A faint smile played on his lips. The wolf had found its freedom, and Eli had found his purpose. For the first time in years, Eli felt whole, a man no longer defined by loss, but by the bonds he had forged. The wolf had come into his life as a wild, mysterious creature and left as a companion and catalyst for change. As Eli turned back to the fields, the morning sun bathing the land in gold, he carried the wolf's lessons with him, his heart lighter and his spirit renewed. The wild wolf was gone, but its presence lingered in every corner of Eli's life, a testament to the beauty of unexpected connections and the transformative power of love. Eli Carter's life, once marked by isolation and grief, had been forever changed by the arrival of the wolf. In their time together, he had rediscovered the joy of companionship and the quiet strength that comes from caring for another living being. The wolf, with its piercing amber eyes and steadfast loyalty, had reminded Eli of the beauty in forging connections where none seemed possible. Through the wolf, Eli learned to embrace vulnerability, to let down the walls he had built over years of solitude. Its presence on the farm had been a gift, teaching him that healing doesn't come from retreating into the shadows but from stepping into the light and finding trust and hope in the unlikeliest of places. Even as the wolf returned to the wild, its spirit lingered, woven into the fabric of Eli's life. On quiet mornings, when the wind whispered through the trees and the sun painted the fields in gold, Eli often thought of the wolf. It had come and gone like the seasons, a fleeting but profound reminder of nature's resilience and interconnectedness. Standing on his porch, Eli looked out at the land, his heart full of gratitude. The wolf was gone, but its legacy endured, wild, free, and eternal, like the land itself.